Good afternoon, all listeners and viewers, and welcome to a somewhat unusual lecture under the aegis of Quattro Coronati Lodge, which, due to the current state of the world, will have to be carried out like this in an online manner as opposed to an in situ appearance in London. My name is Ola Wikander, and I am a senior lecturer and so-called Pro Futura scholar at Lund University in the south of Sweden and at Uppsala University near Stockholm. And I will be talking to you about the relevance of the so-called Northwest Semitic poetic and literary tradition for the understanding of the roots of some pieces of Masonic imagery. And what all this means we'll be getting into in greater detail later on. This talk is a sort of abbreviated free-form summing up of a paper that is to be published in Acta Quattro Coronatorum, and as of this recording can be read in its preprint version on the Quattro Coronati website. So if there are any questions about details that you think I've skipped over here, then please do read the paper in its entirety to get the full gist of the thing, so to speak. So without further ado, let us jump into the wonderful world of ancient Northwest Semitic. We'll see if I can share my little presentation here. There we are. Northwest Semitic, Poetics and Masonic Motifs, as mentioned. And again, my name is Ola Wikander. And in my sort of civilian line of work, I am a scholar of the Hebrew Bible and of Ugaritic, which is, Ugaritic is another Northwest Semitic language, the details of which I will share with you. Well, perhaps not the details of the language, but the details of what Ugaritic is, for those of you who have never heard of it. So there'll be a focus here on the linguistic and poetic traditions of the Hebrew Bible and its close relatives, one of which is Ugaritic. So the title says Northwest Semitic, and the first question, of course, then becomes, what is Northwest Semitic? And to help elucidate that, I've made a little graphic illustration, which we'll look at now. Here it is. This is a linguistic tree of the Semitic languages. The Semitic languages have dominated what we know today as the Near East, which somewhat confusingly today is often called the Middle East, but when we talk about ancient sources, we usually call it the ancient Near East. It's dominated that area for millennia, and to a large extent still does. Semitic languages are languages such as obviously Hebrew and Ugaritic and Arabic and Aramaic and numerous languages in Ethiopia, Akkadian, the language of ancient Assyria and Babylonia. But as you can see in this chart, Semitic is itself only one branch on a much larger linguistic tree, which is known as Afro-Asiatic. And there are a number of other branches of Afro-Asiatic. You can see Afro-Asiatic there being written in red to show that it's the highest node in the tree, this cladistic tree of languages. The other branches are, for example, ancient Egyptian and Berber languages, which you can find in Northern Africa, and a number of other subclades. But Semitic is one of the major ones. And except for Egyptian, the one with the oldest written history of the Afro-Asiatic linguistic family. And the various Semitic languages are divided into various branches. You see, first they're divided into West Semitic and East Semitic, and West Semitic itself has one big branch called Central Semitic. And down there in the bottom left of the chart, you find the Northwest Semitic languages. And Northwest here must be understood in the context of the ancient Near East, which means that northwest means basically the Levant and Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, ancient Israel. And there we see Hebrew, of course, as one of the so-called Canaanite languages. Hebrew is the only one of the Canaanite languages which has a modern version spoken today, modern Hebrew, the language of the modern state of Israel. Phoenician was a major language in antiquity, but it died out and is today preserved only almost only in inscriptional, almost exclusively in inscriptional material. The other main, not Canaanite, but Northwest Semitic language in one of the main ones in antiquity was Aramaic, which became a sort of lingua franca at one time over the entirety of the ancient Near East, and split up into numerous different dialects, which after a while became basically a number of different languages. So Aramaic became a small language family unto itself, and a number of Neo-Aramaic languages are spoken even today. And we have Ugaritic also in yellow. You see I've put Hebrew and Ugaritic in yellow to show that those are the focal points of today's talk. Ugaritic, as you can see, is linguistically sort of an uncle of Hebrew. I usually describe the relationship between classical Hebrew, the language of the Hebrew Bible, and Ugaritic as somewhat analogous to the relationship between the modern Nordic languages, modern Scandinavian languages, of which one is my native language, Swedish, and Old Icelandic, the language of the saga literature, and the Edda, which is in a way sort of analogous to the way Ugaritic literature relates to the Hebrew Bible, as we shall see examples of further on. Then what is Ugaritic? Well, Ugaritic, as the name implies, is the language of Ugarit. And Ugarit is a city, was a major city in the late Bronze Age, in the second millennium BCE. It was destroyed shortly after 1200 BCE, and then virtually unknown, and rediscovered, well, totally unknown actually, and rediscovered in 1928 by chance, and subsequently extensively excavated. And at Ugarit, there was a major discovery of the local language. Ugarit was on the coast of what is today Syria. Here we can see a map where you can see the location of Ugarit at the coast there, and its relation to Canaan, Israel, Palestine, to the Hittite Empire up in the north, to Babylonia, etc. So that's where Ugaritic was. And as befits a city sort of posited at the crossroads of all these major cultures, Ugarit was a very multicultural society unto itself. There are no less than 8 preserved written languages known from Ugarit, which is quite a lot. But among those 8 is the local native language, which we don't know what they called it, if they called it anything at all. Today we call it Ugaritic, after the name of the city. And Ugaritic, as you saw in the linguistic graphical presentation, in the tree, was a rather close relative, older close relative of Hebrew. And one of the most fascinating things about Ugaritic was the way in which it was written, because it was the very writing system in which it was encoded is testament to the crossroads nature and the situatedness of Ugarit at the crossroads of the various major cultural centers of the ancient Near East. And what they did basically was they took the idea of cuneiform. Behind me now you can see a cuneiform tablet, actually a Ugaritic cuneiform tablet. And cuneiform, of course, was the major writing system from Assyria and Babylonia, and earlier than that, Sumer, and also among the Hittites. But they used in Assyria and Babylonia, for example, they used a very cumbersome version, the classical version of cuneiform, which is a very cumbersome writing system using a combination of logographic signs, that is word signs and syllable signs. And it's a really tough task to learn classical Akkadian, that is Assyrio-Babylonian cuneiform. But it's still very practical. You write it on clay with a stylus, which is quite practical and also a very durable type of material, which is why we have these enormous swaths of cuneiform left today, preserved today. So what they did at Ugarit was they crossed that idea, the idea of cuneiform on writing tablets, and they crossed that with the idea of the alphabet, the idea of the short, round 30 letters consonantal alphabet, which was more at home in the Northwest Semitic milieu. That's the same sort of alphabet that the Phoenicians used, and that was subsequently used for Hebrew and then Arabic and Aramaic. That is an alphabet that encoded basically only consonants. In Ugaritic, there are some signs that can actually encode some vowels too, but mostly just consonants. And they created such an alphabet using cuneiform signs. So it was a very artful sort of cross of two principles of writing. And this writing system before Ugarit was discovered, before the discovery of ancient Ugarit, this writing system was unknown to modern scholarship. But since Ugarit was unearthed, literally, huge amounts of Ugaritic text have been, large amounts have been of Ugaritic texts have been found. Among them, very important mythological poetic texts, a number of epic stories, which encode what is sometimes vague, with a sort of vagary called Canaanite religion. Ugarit wasn't actually in Canaan, so it's a sort of a misnomer, but sometimes it's called Canaanite religion because the religion mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as belonging to the Canaanites, the religion where one worshipped gods such as Baal and El and the goddess Anat and Athirat, for example. That type of religious expression is decried in the Hebrew Bible as the worst of heathenism, or at least in the latter part of the later parts of the Hebrew Bible. But suddenly, with the finds from Ugarit, we as scholars suddenly possessed first-hand material from this linguistic and religious tradition. And what one found was that this mythological material was in many ways very, very similar to what one could find in the Hebrew Bible. Not only the language was similar, but the poetic tropes. In some cases, there are actual verbatim correspondences, which could never have appeared by chance, but rather attest to a sort of common mythopoetic linguistic stratum, a common vocabulary, a common mode of poetic expression to which both Ugaritic and Israelite poets could take recourse when constructing their works. So it's not far-fetched to say that both the Hebrew Bible and the Ugaritic epics are two different examples of a common mythopoetic milieu of Northwest Semitic, both linguistically, poetically, and in a literary sense, they are close relatives. And this has been well known among Hebrew Bible scholars now for over half a century, and is taken as a general consensus position, really, that the Hebrew Bible, even though it developed in quite a specific way, due in great part to national experiences such as the Babylonian captivity during the 6th century BCE, notwithstanding such specific developments, the Hebrew Bible is a part of the greater Northwest Semitic religious and literary and cultural milieu, and we as modern scholars of it gain a lot by reading it as such. There is, of course, the question, why these amazing correspondences, these sometimes even literal correspondences, why they're there. I mean, in earlier scholarship, one sometimes finds the idea that the Israelites somehow borrowed Ugaritic directly from Ugaritic writings, which is not really possible because, like I said, Ugarit was destroyed shortly after 1200 BCE, which means that there is no real opportunity for borrowing, as the writing of the main parts of the Hebrew Bible are centuries later than that, many centuries in many cases. So I like to put it like this. This is a phrase I've used on many occasions, and I will use it here as well. The Hebrew Bible did not borrow from Northwest Semitic culture. It is Northwest Semitic culture. And the reason why I often reiterate this is to start with the presupposition that even though the Hebrew Bible, what became the Old Testament in the Christian world, even though it has a very later received a very special specific history indeed, due to the canonization of its words as Holy Scripture for a number of religions, it still grew out of the same Northwest Semitic cultural background, and to understand, especially its more archaic text, but not only its more archaic text, especially them, but not exclusively them, it must be read as such. So that's the perspective I will be taking here. So that's Ugaritic. And here we have the beautiful map again, courtesy of Wikimedia Commons. And here we have the image, you can see behind me, an actual Ugaritic clay tablet. Beautiful, isn't it? So what does this have to do with Freemasonry? Well, what I will be talking about here is the possibility of viewing Freemasonry, or rather some mythological ideas prevalent in Freemasonry, as a repository of ideas that in a way go back to Northwest Semitic. And what does that mean? Does that mean that I'm going to sit here and argue that Freemasonry is secretly a sort of stash of old heathen evil stuff? You know, that's a sort of allegation that's been done spuriously, often during the years, often based on quite faulty scholarship, flawed scholarship and faulty data, actually. No, that's not my point. My point is that since the rituals and mythology of Freemasonry started and then later on grew based on texts to a very large extent taken from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, reshuffled, reworked, changed, it cannot help but inherit some parts of the motifs that the Hebrew Bible itself inherited from its common Northwest Semitic background, which we know a bit more of if we look at the Ugaritic material as well. So that's the sort of comparison I'll be doing here today, and indeed do in my paper. Actually, it is my contention that due to the attacks upon Freemasonry from people associating it with various ancient cultures and doing that for pejorative purposes, you know, given that state of affairs, it's actually a desideratum to look at these things using a more solid philological method and a more solid basis in the actual sources, because it's an interesting subject. And as you see here, I've used the expression longue durée, which is of course originally a phrase from the field of social history, but it has relevance here too. The longue durée in this context, what I mean by that is the idea that history, and especially the history ideas and motifs, is rarely a matter of discrete events, but rather of a slow moving river of ideas, not a secret tradition of ideas, but a river of ideas where motifs are inherited, sometimes borrowed, and I mean inherited not in a genetic sense, but in a sort of ideological and teaching-y sense, and ideas that once existed can be repurposed for entirely new context. And we have examples of that even just in the Christian New Testament, which uses texts from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, and repurposes them for entirely new contexts and entirely new purposes, which the original authors of the Hebrew text would have been very, very much surprised at. And it's that sort of connection that I will be looking at also in the case of Masonic material. Yeah, so like I write here, the attacks of anti-Masons and the speculations of some too creatively minded Masonic writers, because there had been Masons doing this as well, you know, trying to find spurious connections with every ancient culture under the sun. The attacks and speculations have hidden actual connections to the greater Northwest Semitic mythopoetic tradition mediated through the Hebrew Bible. And I'll be looking at a few possible such cases here, and I'll do that by looking at two of the most famous Masonic stories of all, that of the Hiramic legend and that of the Royal Arch. Again, here I want to point out that I'm not referring to a secret, well, I did use the word stream, but not a secret stream or a secret tradition of connections to the ancient world, nor am I talking about wild proto-religio historical comparative speculation. You can find that in early Masonic writers like Albert Pike and Wilmshurst and lots of these guys who basically think that if two things are similar, then they're the same, because there's one big tradition, and Freemasonry is a sort of repository of ancient wisdom. That's not my point. No, as you see on the screen, rather my point is Freemasonry being, as a biblical tradition in the wide sense of the term, an interesting focal point for a number of traditions present in ancient Northwest Semitic materials that were yet again transformed and reinculturated. And this in itself is nothing weirder than this having happened within the pages of the Hebrew Bible itself. You can see it looking at, say, first the Book of Kings, and then stories from the Book of Kings being changed and repurposed in the Book of Chronicles by later authors. And then it happens in the New Testament and rabbinic literature. And the same thing, I believe, was going on and with some Masonic material. All right, the main text from Ugaritic that we'll be using to illustrate ancient Northwest Semitic mythology is the so-called Baal Cycle, which, as the name implies, is the story of the young storm god Baal. In the pantheon of Ugaritic, Baal is the young, angry hero man. There's an old ruler god called El, which just means God. The same word is used in the Hebrew Bible, meaning God. But El is rather sedate, and he's not a very hands-on ruler. He and his wife Athirat, they sort of back off, and then the younger gods vie for supremacy. And the indisputed protagonist of these stories is Baal, who of course in the Hebrew Bible is presented as a very evil god indeed. The word Baal, or Baalu in Ugaritic, simply means Lord, just like Adonai, which is used for the Hebrew god, also means Lord. Baal means Lord. And the Baal Cycle is the story of the exploits of Baal and his friends and enemies. And it's basically tripartite in nature. It's made up of 6 clay tablets. And first it's a story of Baal battling the god of the sea, the god Yam. Yam means sea. Yam means sea in Hebrew as well. And there are a number of stories in the Hebrew Bible in which it's Yahweh battling the great sea. You can find a number of places like the Book of Job. You can find it in a number of Psalms, like where Yahweh battles either sea itself or a big sea monster or dragon. You can find that in Psalm 89, for example, or in Psalm 74. So Baal, first, he does what a good storm god should. He pacifies the chaotic sea. But then, when he's done that, he has to build himself somewhere to rule. And he has to build himself a palace or a temple, which is apparently the same thing. And it's a big sort of there's a lot of trouble going on there for him getting the permission to build a temple atop his holy mountain Saban, and then getting his friends to do this. But finally he builds his temple, and then he gets threatened by Mort, who is the god of death, who lives in the underworld down in a hole in the ground basically, and he threatens Baal, and Baal becomes very afraid. Baal descends into the gullet of death. And what happens then is that a great drought ensues and nothing can grow because Baal and his rains aren't there to guarantee growth. Just as Yahweh, as a big storm god, guarantees rain, you find this in many places in the Hebrew Bible, that rain and growth is entirely, and precipitation is entirely dependent on Yahweh. So here it's dependent on Baal. And when Baal is gone down into the maw of personified death, which had swallowed him, then nothing can grow, and it's a great, the entire land dies basically. And finally he comes back and reclaims his kingdom, which we'll go into in greater detail. His body is found and he's ceremoniously buried, and then he returns. Before talking to this in greater detail, I want to quote Mark Smith, who is one of the premier scholars of Ugaritic today, especially of the Baal Cycle. He's written together with Wayne Pittard, written the big commentary to the Baal Cycle. And he's written, and I want to quote this, that he wrote in an introduction to one of his translations of the Baal Cycle, where he talks about the persistence of motifs. And there we come back to this idea of persistence of motifs. Persistence of motifs, which we find in the Baal Cycle all the way into, in this case, the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And he writes this: the closing chapters of the book of Revelation provide a glimpse of the future that recalls the three major themes of the Baal Cycle: Baal's defeat of Yam, the building of Baal's heavenly palace, and his conflict with Mort. Revelation chapter 21 mentions the death of sea, the descent of the heavenly city, akin to Baal's palace, and the final destruction of death. Note the capital D there. In sum, the early forms of many formative religious concepts of Western civilization may be found in the Baal Cycle. And this, my friends, is exactly the point I want to make. In sum, the early forms of many formative religious concepts of Western civilization may be found in the Baal Cycle. So we're talking here about the long-term, the longue durée persistence of motifs known from Northwest Semitic poetic tradition, specifically the Baal Cycle. Okay. So again, a little resume of Baal's story. Baal builds his temple or palace after much trouble. He finally gets to build his temple, and he has a sort of housewarming party. He invites the various gods to party it out with him. He builds this temple or palace on his divine mountain Saban. He's then threatened by Mort, the god of death, because he's apparently neglected to invite him. And Mort scares him and says that even though you defeated the sea monster, the heavens will burn and shine. That is, drought will rule. Your life-giving rains will no longer hold sway. You must go down into my gullet. And Baal does. Baal is all afraid. Gets all afraid, and he does descend. And and what happens is exactly what was prophesied. Drought ensues. Just as Yahweh must send his rain, so must Baal, and Baal cannot send his rain when he is in the netherworld. So drought ensues and everything is burnt to a crisp. We must remember that Ugarit, just as the Hebrew Bible, the land of the Hebrew Bible, is in a very arid type of climate. The other gods learn of Baal's demise and they mourn him, and they send out a sort of search party after him. Specifically, the goddess of the sun, Shapshu, is to search for him. She finds his body. She and Baal's sister, the violent goddess Anat, they find the body and they carry it up on Mount Saban and bury it ceremoniously. By the way, the word sapan, or possibly sapun, is etymologically the cognate of the Hebrew word saphon, which is used in a number of cases in the Hebrew Bible to mean the divine mountain. In that case, of course, not Baal's divine mountain, but Yahweh's divine mountain. Later on, it just starts to mean north, because the mountain is apparently in a northerly direction. The literal Mount Sapan is to the north of Ugarit, but the word occurs for the divine mountain in Hebrew as well. Finally, Baal comes back to life. Mot and Baal wrestle it out on Mount Sapan, and it's basically a tie, because you cannot defeat death. That's sort of the existential truth that this story encodes, that you cannot defeat death, you can only pacify him. And the sun goddess declares Baal the winner, but it's quite clear that Mot is temporarily defeated. He is not killed, but some sort of balance is at least reinstated. That's the basic story of the Baal-Mot conflict, known from the Baal Cycle at Ugarit. And here is Baal, the so-called Baal Stele from Ugarit. You can see him wielding his club and his cedar weapon, which is probably a symbol of his lightning. And you see the king in front of him. The little guy is the king, and under his feet you see the waves, because he has pacified the sea. The first part of the story, as we talked about, was about here Baal fighting it out with sea, just as Yahweh does. And here we see the pacified sea under his feet. This stele is today in the Louvre. Okay, let's look at this in the context of the Hiramic legend. Which are the parallels to which I was referring? Well, they're quite obvious, and I'm sure many of you already have thought of them. We have a hero being killed. We have a sort of descent. We have a search for a body, a ceremonious burial in connection with a temple when the body is found. We have some sort of rising or raising. To be sure, the canonical version, so to speak, of the Hiramic legend does not say that Hiram gets resurrected. It's often stated that he is, but the classical canonical version does not say that. There have been versions of Masonic ritual where he has literally been said to be resurrected, but regardless of whether or not there is a literal resurrection described, there is a sort of opposition between being murdered and lost and then returned to and being raised to a lively perpendicular, as it were. This happens in the context of temple building in both of the cases. And also it's interesting to note that the story of Hiram is in itself an interesting case of inter-Northwest Semitic internationalism, given that both the Masonic story and the biblical one on which it is built talks about King Solomon contacting his friend, King Hiram, in Phoenicia. And then, of course, Hiram being from up there, being sent from there. So it's literally a story of Northwest Semitic collaboration, which of course is something the Masonic ritualists would not have thought of. Neither would the biblical authors, but it's interesting, still the same. And as we said, there have been much vain speculation about these sort of parallels. The thing is, this all ties together with the question of the quote dying and rising gods of the ancient Near East. Once upon a time, there was a big sort of meta-analysis going on that not only the ancient Near East, but the entire world was filled with gods thought to die and rise. And then it became en vogue to say that there had never been any ideas of such gods. Tryggve Mettinger in Sweden has convincingly showed that in the ancient Near East there was a recurring myth theme of gods that actually were thought to die and come back. Not much more than that, but yeah, it happened. And some speculative people, more speculative people, have of course often connected this with the story of Jesus of Nazareth. I would definitely not say that Jesus of Nazareth is a dying and rising God. That would be an inane statement. But still, the story of Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament is also an example of this juxtaposition of death, descent, and return in some way, in a very different way than Baal. And what the Masonic ritualists sometimes seem to have done is conflate that sort of story with the story of Hiram the builder, or the one making the beautiful ornaments, with the story of the murder of the tax collector Adoram. Again, sometimes too much has been done of these with these parallels, but there is something here, a bigger myth theme: death, descent, return, which we find at Ugaritic, which we find in a way in the New Testament, and which we find in the Masonic material, which should not be ignored. And again, I would like to point out the combination between this murder and descent, the raising, with a temple building. So what I would like to argue is that the Masonic material the Masonic story has, in a rather amazing way, taken what were assorted building blocks of old Northwest Semitic tradition and put them together in a way which looks quite a lot like the way in which they were originally, but early on, put together in, say, the Baal Cycle. That doesn't mean it's inherited from the Baal Cycle, but it means that the motifs the building blocks are similar and have been put in and have been put together in a way which resembles it, and that this is not entirely due to chance, but to the motifs themselves having been mediated through the Hebrew Bible. And we know examples of this process from the Hebrew Bible itself. One example I personally love is the story of Joseph, which to a large extent repurposes these old Baal Cycle-esque motifs, but in a very different way. What happens to Joseph? He gets thrown into the well, into the bore in Hebrew, the pit. Just as Baal descends into the pit, he's thrown into the pit not once but twice, because he also ends up in an Egyptian prison, also called a bore. It's the same word. He survives down there and rises up again to great success. His father uses the phrase, "After my son, I shall descend into the earth," or the netherworld, which is exactly what Baal's father, El, says when Baal dies. So it's the same descent motif, the same rise motif, the same imagery of the pit as the land of the dead. But there's no hint of Joseph being resurrected. Not at all. No hint of Joseph actually dying, but the motifs of the pit as representing the land of the dead in a sort of poetic way is undoubtedly connected, and the expression used by the father, "After my son I shall descend," goes to show this. It's shown even more clearly by the fact that the Egyptian name that Joseph is given by the pharaoh when he's given a new career, as it were, is an Egyptian name which probably means God says, "Let him live." And the word God here, there it's in Egyptian, but the word underlying God there is probably Elohim or El, which shows that this is the old El saying, "My son is alive" thing going on, which is exactly what happens in the Baal cycle. When Baal comes back to life, his dad El says, "Baal is alive." So even that has been repurposed in the Joseph story. And this sort of repurposing I'm suggesting for the Hiram story. Not that it's literally inherited, not at all, but that motival blocks have been repurposed in a new way. Here are the words Mort uses when Baal is to descend: "And go down into the house of freedom, the earth. May you be counted among those that descend into the earth." Note the correspondence with biblical expressions like this we have from Ezekiel: بهرتيخ اليردبور العام علام وهشفتيخ بأرض تحتيوت. I will make you descend with those who go down into the pit, to the people of old, and I'll make you dwell in the land below. This is just to show the relationship between the Ugaritic material and the Hebrew one. And down there at the bottom of the screen, you see the mourning for Baal by El. Baal is dead, what of the people? After Baal, I will descend into the earth. And this is basically exactly what is said in the Joseph story. So, the parallels with the Hiramic story. Is this just coincidence? Were the Masonic ritualists aware that the story they were telling about a Phoenician artisan and his interactions with the Israelite monarchy seems to echo ideas from the extra-biblical Northwest Semitic milieu of which Phoenicia was a part? No, they most certainly were not aware of that. How would they have been able to be aware of that? That's not my point. We can explain the coincidences in two ways. One of them is just say, the correspondences. One of them is saying coincidence. This is possible, but it doesn't carry much explanatory power, given that the Masonic stories were very overtly biblical in character. They're built on a biblically infused culture. They were built on Hebrew stories from the Hebrew Bible, and they were both informed at and aiming at repurposing such stories for a specific milieu, that is Masonic ritual. So it's not very parsimonious to just talk about coincidence in this case, but rather it's easier to talk about motifs, motival building blocks being repurposed and inherited. And I'd like to compare here with a study of Indo-European mythology, Indo-European being, of course, the linguistic family to which English and Swedish and German and Latin and many others belong. Within the field of Indo-European studies, there has been a very lively discussion going on for a long time. The main name here, but not at all the only one, is Calvert-Watkins, about reconstructing the mythology of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, that is our, quote, linguistic ancestors, unquote, by looking at, again, verbatim correspondences between mythologies of different Indo-European peoples, similar motifs in Indo-European stories, that is repurposing of Indo-European poetic tales for new contexts. And what one can find there is that there are irrefutable similarities between phrases and motifs in Indo-European stories, but used for entirely different things. They can be repurposed, but for entirely different things. Like there's an expression for sacrificing a horse, which seems to have been a big thing in Proto-Indo-European times. And we find this expression in clearest of all in ancient Vedic India, but we find it also reminiscences of it in ancient Rome and among the Celts. But the actual rituals seem to have been totally different. So there's the formulae, the ideas, the motifs have survived, but not necessarily the context they're put into. And again, this is the type of longue durée correspondence I am looking for. So we have temple building, we have death and descent, we have rising or raising, overcoming death, proper burial, and of course, inter-Northwest Semitic contacts. We now move on to the Royal Arch, and there is probably no part of Freemasonry that has been so maligned on the account of Canaanites as has the Holy Royal Arch, because there's been a barrage of authors who have alleged that a part of a certain word occurring in some versions of the Holy Royal Arch alludes to the god Baal. And this originally was certainly not the case. We know this because the early sources don't bear that out at all. So these allegations of Baalism there are spurious, misguided, and just wrong. Yet, there is more to be found here. Neville Barker Cryer has posited that in an early 18th century ritual text called the Rite de Bouillon, An early version of this alleged word appears, but not in its canonical form, but in a form beginning with Z, Zabal, Zabul, and that this would have, and he posits that this was the origin of the word in question. The funny thing is that this word, the original one, is derived directly from probably a Hebrew version of a Northwest Semitic verbal root, Z, B, L. Semitic languages almost always have verbal roots in 3 consonants. And this verbal root, zabel, has to do with lordliness or princeliness. And it's used for princely dwellings and princely rulers and lordly homes, etc. And it's probably the lordly dwelling that's the origin of it here. We find it in the Hebrew Bible used when talking about Yahweh's dwelling in his temple, as we shall see. This zabal, zabul. Here's the famous verse from 1 Kings 8. Adonai amar lishkon ba'arafel, bano vaniti bet zavulach, machon leshivtecha olamim. This is from Solomon's installation speech of the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. Yahweh has said that he wants to dwell in darkness. I have truly built you a lordly house, a Beit Zavul. There you have the Zavul, a place for your eternal dwelling. And here you find the use of this root that Neville Barker Cryer argued was the original basis of the Royal Arch word. Here you find it in its biblical context when talking about Yahweh's presence is almost physicalized, but not quite, but very, very concrete presence in the Jerusalem temple. Which is his Beit Zavul, his lordly house, his princely house. But the plot thickens because, like I said, this root, use of the princeliness root, has an earlier Northwest Semitic pedigree, which we can find, not surprisingly, reflected at Ugarit in the Baal Cycle. Because there, this word is used at the title of the god Baal himself. He's called Zabulu Baalu Artsi. I've put in the probable vowels there, so you can pronounce it. Zabulu Baalu Artsi, Prince Baal of the earth, Lord Baal of the earth, which is quite a funny name because Baalu in itself, like I said, means Lord, so it's Prince Lord of the earth, Lord. But he is called Zabulu. So this Zavul or Zabul was connected to the whole idea of the Northwest Semitic ruling storm god in his temple. And that is why probably it appears in 1 Kings 8. There's this old tradition of describing the ruling Northwest Semitic storm god residing in his temple in these terms. And it's used for Baal and it's used for Yahweh. And I propose that it's almost uncanny, though not surprising, that it appears in the Rite de Bouillon and in the later Royal Arch history flowing from that. So it signifies, in this case, Baal, the temple builder, but also in that case, Yahweh living in his temple, in his Zabul. So there is a sort of connection with the Baal texts, but in a completely different way than alleged by the anti-Masons. And a way, of course, mediated through the story of Yahweh's temple. Another common ancient Near Eastern mythological trope that we can find in the story of the Royal Arch is that of hidden deeps, hidden depths, wisdom being hidden deep below the ground, hidden riches. This is something we can find in a number of ancient Near Eastern texts. We have the idea in Mesopotamia of the Apsu, the under, which is the under the subterranean sweetwater ocean of wisdom. That's what Gilgamesh got his wisdom from in the Mesopotamian tradition. We have it in Northwest Semitic as well. One of the clearest examples is Job chapter 28, which is a big soliloquy on finding wisdom as though it were through mining under the earth. And it appears that this idea of wisdom being hidden under the earth is even encoded linguistically in a number of Northwest Semitic languages. That is, there has been a fusion of poetic storytelling and linguistic root analysis, because, like I said, Semitic languages in general are really big on verbal roots, specifically triliteral verbal roots, and they often played with this, using verbal roots to express specific poetic meaning. And one important verbal root in this context is the root amak, which has to do with being deep. Amek in Hebrew is valley or depth or deep. This root probably is the basis of the Akkadian, or perhaps at least is the basis of the Akkadian word nemeku, meaning wisdom. And Edward Greenstein, Hebraist and Ugaritologist, has argued that this idea of wisdom being hidden in the deep is actually alluded to in Psalm 92 in this verse here. Ma gadalu ma'asecha Adonai ma'od amaku machshavotecha. How great are your deeds, O Yahweh? How very deep are your thoughts? It's the exact same metaphor used when we talk today of a deep thinker. So this proves that in the Hebrew Bible and in the general ancient Near Eastern context and the Northwest Semitic context, this idea that wisdom was a hidden gem deep below the earth. This was a thing. This was a motif that was floating around, and this was something that is reflected in the Hebrew Bible, and this is therefore a motif with which the early Masonic ritualists may have been acquainted. Thus, again, to sum up, we have in the Ugaritic writings, in the Baal Cycle, the idea of death and rising in some manner, which we also have in the Hiramic legend. We have the idea of temple building. We have the idea of hidden depths and descents into them. We have terminology for princeliness. We have the idea of the divine presence in the temple. So there are these uncanny similarities. Actually, when I was a young doctoral student at a conference in Göttingen, and I was presenting a paper on the Baal Cycle and the story of Baal and Mort, the very distinguished professor there, who was chairing the session, the first thing he said to me is, "Are you a Freemason?" At the time, I was not, and so the question was somewhat bewildering to me. But now, given what we're talking about here, I suddenly understand the sort of thing he was probably thinking of, I guess. But again, what do these connections mean? Do they mean a big secret stream of Ugariticness going down through the ages into 18th century Masonic ritualism? No, of course it doesn't. Again, I want to reiterate this. No. There have been modern serious authors like Piatigorsky, who, for example, who view the third degree ritual in terms of ancient mythologies in a more sort of psychological way. But that's not really what I'm talking about either. I mean, it doesn't negate that, but that's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a pattern of motifs that were there, that was cut up into pieces and then put together in a remarkably similar way. And why is it remarkably similar? It's because the motifs, because the motifs are there. They're all there, mediated through the Hebrew Bible. You can find them there. And the Hebrew Bible got them from its background in the greater Northwest Semitic milieu, of which Ugarit is one example. And then they were put together in a similar way because they fit rather well in that way, and because it has, I'd say from a personal standpoint, a sort of existential meaning, but that's neither here nor there. So what I'm talking about is neither borrowing nor conscious imitation of like Baalist sources. That would be ludicrous indeed, because the early Masonic ritualists knew nothing about Ugarit. But I'm talking about longue durée persistence of certain transformed motifs mediated through the Hebrew Bible. And again, I want to compare this with the persistence of the motif of descent and rising again, descent into a pit, a bore, the grieving father wanting to descend after his son into the netherworld, which is almost literally the same as Il and Baal in the Joseph story, We have the same thing in Isaiah chapter 27 verse 1, where the Leviathan, the great sea monster, is described in the very same, literally the same extremely uncommon vocabulary which is used to describe the same sea monster at Ugarit. So this sort of repurposing of motifs that I'm talking about. And if it could happen between Ugarit and the Hebrew Bible, there's no methodological reason to stop there. There's no methodological reason to presuppose that just because the Hebrew Bible was canonized, that because of that, this sort of stream of motifs stopped. It's just an arbitrary line that we've drawn because drawn in history, but history doesn't work like that. History doesn't stop just because we've decided that a certain corpus of text is now holy. That's not the way history works. The same sort of repurposing would have been going on in circles devoted to the text of the Hebrew Bible. And this, of course, is what I think must, in a way, have happened. So, in conclusion, yes, Freemasonry is a repository of Northwest Semitic mythology in a sort of transformed manner, not in the wild, idealized manner of the speculative authors of yesteryear, but as repurposed motifs with death, rebirth, princely dwellings, wisdom hidden in the depths. And given how much speculative and uninformed ink has been spilled on this question, I believe that the search for uncovering actual inheritances and parallels is a real desideratum, because there was once just wild speculation and wild comparativism going on, and the primary sources of ancient Northwest Semitic outside the Bible were virtually unknown. Now we have a much better position to do this. We're in a much better position to perform this type of comparison. And a funny thing, the wild comparativists, they in a way influenced the tradition they were studying. When they thought they found connections to Canaanite stuff, to Babylonian stuff, they sometimes actually influenced ritual. I mean, there are versions, very heterodox, but still versions of Masonic ritual, which literally invokes various ancient deities in these parallels, like the parallel with Hiram. And this is a sort of rereading of these modern spurious connections into the material, Assmann, in his book Religio Duplex, has mentioned this idea of how early Freemasons and then later Freemasons as well sometimes view themselves as a sort of representing a sort of elite, some of them as a sort of elite double religion, not a religion in the sense, but a wisdom teaching, which could be connected to ancient wisdom narratives. And this is something that has happened. People have compared with ancient deities, and in some cases even written that into their ritual books, not in the standard official rituals, but in higher degrees of some forms and in some heterodox versions. I recommend, for example, the Rituale Italico for reading. It's a blast if you're into this sort of thing. So there's been a continuous dialectic going on between actual inheritance of that Masonic mythology possesses from Northwest Semitic sources via the Hebrew Bible, and the projections of Masons and anti-Masons who in a rather hit-and-miss fashion attempted to find such connections within Masonry itself, which shows a sort of weird Hegelian thing going on between the actual history of it and the imaginings of creative souls. So, like the depths of Ugaritic and biblical poetry, this larger tradition underlies the origin, or is at least in the background, of Masonic thought. And like those depths of Masonic thought, that origin needs to be excavated, as Ugarit was excavated, with diligence, with persistence, and light. And here's Baal again, just to whet your appetite. And there I thank you very much for your attention.